All right, Gemini, I had to tap into my different type of music for this video. I'm going to listen to some heavier music for this video. Gemini or ENTJ. I have been battling an Gemini or ENTJ in court for the last several years. Holy moly. I'm an Aquarian INTJ mind battling a Gemini, Cancer, Mercury. It's been something else. So, Gemini was one of the first astro-psychological ebooks I wrote just to figure out what the F was going on with that personality. Males, I am not fond of. Gemini males, I will not lie to you, I'm not fond of. Gemini females, all of my really close girlfriends in high school, lifelong girlfriends, Gemini. I had many Geminis, Libras as well. So I do love the air sign females. Geminis, y'all are something else. So let's break Gemini down. I am ready. This is my last video in this moral load bearing / inner and outer masculine and feminine integration work, developmental work, distorted order work. This is the last archetype. So this series has been absolutely phenomenal, extremely challenging. The most challenging series I've ever done to date, but it was entirely worth it because it is extremely foundational. All right, so don't forget to like and subscribe. I have finally reached my 500 subscriber goal, but I still need 1,200 or so more watch hours to get my low tier monetization on this channel. So I'm giving myself 6 months or so to conquer that. I need to start making shorts, but I am on an absolute rampage of laying down extremely foundational work here through the archetypes. So I've got like 20 series going on. I'm getting closer to finishing this one out so I can move on to another topic. Has been totally worth it. Very fun. I'm going to produce a 700-page ebook out of this series, so totally worth it. All right, so welcome back to Underwater Panther. Heather here with Underwater Panther. This is where we don't do surface level personality content. We break down the architecture behind behavior. We map how identity actually forms, how distortion develops, how polarity moves under pressure, and how moral weight is carried, avoided, or discharged across the entire system. This is not about labeling people. This is about understanding how the human system actually works. So you can see in real time in yourself, in relationships, and in the world around you. And if you've been following this series, and you already know, we just came out of Aquarius or the INTJ, a system that was right but mistimed, a system that saw too early, defined too early, and acted too late. Now we're moving into something completely different because Gemini does not have a timing problem. Gemini has a directional problem. And if you try to understand this archetype the same way you understand Aquarius, you will misread it completely. All right, so I am going to bring up my key cards. So I am running each personality type through 3 axes: the overall masculine and feminine, the overall moral load bearing ranking, and the inner and outer masculine and feminine. As well as Astro-Psychology. Gemini, there we go. All right, so I'm going to leave this up here as I explain what the heck is going on. So I do combine astrology and psychology. So Gemini is ruled by Mercury astrologically. In my system, I have the North Node here. Jupiter in left field and the south node in fall. Psychologically, you have extroverted thinking hero, introverted intuition parent, extroverted sensing child, and introverted feeling inferior. So that is where I started over 10 years ago, and I have been working on updating the system, my entire system. So now I am introducing moral load bearing, overall masculine and feminine, and the inner and outer masculine and feminine quadrants. So OM represents outer masculine, IF is inner feminine, OF is outer feminine, and IM is inner masculine. All right, so what this video is actually doing, I do have allergies, so I do apologize if my nose is itchy, my throat is getting scratchy. I've already recorded an hour and a half of video. I am powering through this. All right, so what this video is actually doing. All right, Gemini is not a perception first system. It is not an identity first system, and it is definitely not a stability first system. Gemini is a movement first system, so nervous system. It does not begin by asking what something is. Gemini begins by engaging with it, by speaking, by interacting, by organizing reality in real time, before it has fully decided what that reality means. And that single difference changes everything about this system, how this system develops, how it adapts, and where it becomes stable. So in this video, what we're doing is not just explaining Gemini. We are breaking down the entire architecture of how Gemini becomes itself throughout its lifespan, so how they develop throughout the ages, childhood, adolescence, etc. We're breaking down the entire architecture of how Gemini becomes itself. From childhood all the way through pre-30 pressure, and then I will expand that out into after 30 years old and reintegration of each of these quadrants. So using the full system, masculine through feminine axis, moral load-bearing axis, quadrant sequence, inner and outer masculine and feminine, real life developmental stages between 1 and 30, and then the final video will be 30 and beyond with reintegration, and then distortion patterns and integration points. We start by grounding Gemini structurally, where it actually sits in the system. So on the masculine and feminine axis overall, Gemini is tier 4 androgynous. So this would make the psychological people as well as Gemini triggered AF. I'm fine with that. It's like my main objective here for a very long time is understanding masculine and feminine polarity. So y'all, it's deep. If you want to debate, I am all for it. All right, so which means it does not naturally hold direction. Gemini moves between masculine and feminine. Gemini adapts, responds, shifts depending on the environment. And while that creates flexibility, it removes automatic stability. So Gemini is a mutable sign by temperament. Mutable is flexible, adaptable, forever changing, mutable, adapting to others' thinking and communication through the air intellectualism. So they are an intellectual. All right, so we're going to break down the overall masculine and feminine for Gemini, tier 4 androgynous. What are they? Number 8. Number 8 on my ranking system. Then we will move into the moral load-bearing axis or layer, because Gemini is not just fluid in direction, it is fluid in consequence as well. Moral load-bearing, consequence. What consequence? On the moral load-bearing axis, Gemini is also tier 4 full motion nervous system. So, which means it does not retain moral weight. Gemini processes and then it moves. Gemini does not carry tension long term. They discharge it through engagement, communication, and movement. That is physical and mental movement. And when you combine those things, low directional anchoring and low moral retention, You get a system that is highly intelligent, highly adaptive, and highly responsive, but fundamentally unanchored if identity is not developed intentionally. Then we move into the quadrants, because this is where Gemini becomes visible in how it actually processes reality. And this is the core their distortion order, excuse me. I will bring up another key card breaking this down in depth. So their distortion order sequence is outer masculine, inner feminine, outer feminine, and then inner masculine, which does line up with the psychological arena people. TE hero, psychologically, they say develops between the age of 1 and 12. NI parent, 12 and 20. SE child, 20 and 30 or 35. FI inferior starts kicking online between ages 30 and 35. Talking about psychological development. All right, so they engage, pattern, explore, and then work on their values late, which means Gemini enters reality first, tracks it second, experiences it third, and only at the very end tries to define itself within it. All right, so then from there, we will break down the full development timeline. So childhood 1 through 12 with TE hero, and the outer masculine quadrant with Mercury ruler. So this represents engagement before identity, processing through speaking, movement, and interaction, learning through exposure, not internal anchoring. So extroverted, TE, extroverted thinking. They are an extroverted personality type. All right, so then we move on to NI parent, inner feminine quadrant, and north node in adolescence. So we work on this quadrant from the ages of 12 to 20 or so. So this represents pattern awareness without selection, seeing multiple directions without choosing one. Adaptability increases, identity still unstable. Then we will move into discussing the outer feminine with SE child and Jupiter in left field, or in early adulthood. So ages 18 to 20, 25 to 30, give or take, give or take. So expansion without consolidation, capability rises, continuity does not, multiple paths, minimal anchoring. And then we will break down the inner masculine quadrant with FI inferior and the south node in my system. This represents the identity gap becomes visible, patterns repeat, movement no longer replaces direction, and the system is forced to confront. I understand everything, but what is actually mine? We also break down in depth how Gemini is experienced, how it feels to others, engaging but inconsistent, present but not always stable, understanding but not always anchored, how Gemini feels internally, fluid, adaptive, responsive. I am being real in the moment, not realizing continuity is missing. Then we go deeper into how moral weight moves through Gemini, how it charges through communication and action, how Gemini overprocesses through pattern tracking, how they explore without anchoring, and why identity is delayed until last. And most importantly, we connect all of it because this video is not just about Gemini behavior, it is about understanding why movement without anchoring creates instability, why processing is not the same as choosing, why intelligence does not automatically create identity, and why sequence, not ability, is the actual issue. All of the intellectuals, all of the air sign elements, personality types have identity issues, if you couldn't tell. Information. All right, so Gemini does not struggle with intelligence. Gemini struggles with identity stabilization under constant movement. And if you really understand what we covered here, then you understand something much bigger than Gemini. You understand how a system can process everything, adapt to anything, understand everything, and still not become anything until it learns how to choose and hold. So whether you're a Gemini or dealing with one, Gemini or ENTJ, this video gives you the full map, how the system moves, how it avoids anchoring, where distortion forms, and where integration actually has to happen. All right, so in the next video after this, we're going to go into what happens after the age of 30, where Gemini is no longer allowed to stay in motion, where all 4 quadrants have to be reintegrated into sequence, where movement finally has to become direction, and where identity stops being optional and becomes necessary. All right, so before we get into Gemini, I need to ground something first, because if you try to understand this archetype the same way you just understood Aquarius in my last video, you're going to misread it completely. Gemini is not a perception first system. It is not an identity first system. It is definitely not a stability first system. Gemini is a movement first system. It does not begin by asking what something is. It begins by engaging with it, by speaking, by organizing in real time, by interacting with the environment before it has fully processed what the environment means. And that single difference changes everything about how this system develops, how it adapts, and where it becomes unstable. On the masculine and feminine axis, Gemini sits at tier 4. So let me bring this up. Oh, I have to actually put that in front. Okay, so we're in axis 1. So it's okay to cover the other ones for the moment. All right, so we are talking about the overall masculine through feminine ranking, axis 1. This represents how energy moves throughout the entire archetype. So, masculine is outward force, direction setting, boundary projection, initiates structure and absorbs consequence. Feminine, inward processing, attunement, integration, response, integrates impact, and restores connection. This is about vector. What way does energy move under pressure overall? All right, so Gemini is number 8. So that means they are in tier 4 by themselves, androgynous bridge. All right, so this means Gemini is not anchored strongly in masculine direction or feminine receptivity. It moves between them. Gemini adapts. Gemini shifts depending on context. And while that creates flexibility and responsiveness, it also means the system does not naturally hold direction on its own. It can move in many directions, but it does not automatically select one. I like to say they just sit on top of the fence. They talk to everyone. They will spread drama and information like they have no loyalty to anyone. This is just like I'm going to try not to crack on Gemini too hard, but it is what it is. I see y'all. I see what you're doing. I'm the eldest air sign. You're the baby air sign. It is what it is. So, Gemini is in tier 4, androgynous bridge, overall masculine and feminine. So, they sit on the fence, even in their masculine and feminine polarity, not just in the relationships. How Gemini regulates through translation and rapid perspective shifting. So, Gemini, I'm going to say something, their communication style, they can talk to anyone about anything, and you will think that you're having an amazing, deep conversation, but they literally talk to talk. It is not emotionally that deep for them. Just letting you know. All right, so Gemini connects everything but fractures under pressure because stress demands commitment, not oscillation. So they look masculine when detached, feminine when attuned, unstable when forced to choose. Shadow risk is fragmentation and contextual morality. Okay, so next we'll get into the moral load. All right, so I'm going to keep that there for a moment. All right, so next we're going into the moral load axis, which actually is in front of your face on the new key card I created. All right, so on the moral load bearing axis, Gemini sits at number 12, very last, tier 4, as a full motion nervous system. This means Gemini processes moral weight through movement rather than retention. Gemini does not hold tension for long. It encounters, processes, then moves on. Moral weight passes through the system instead of setting it in it. And because of that, Gemini can engage with complex situations quickly, but they do not anchor the consequence of those situations in a stable internal way. All right, so let me break down what moral load actually is, where consequence is internally held. So this ranking answers something entirely different. When something goes wrong, who feels it inside first? So this ranking is about internalized responsibility, conscience pressure, consequence absorption, guilt versus shame versus avoidance. Who carries failure psychologically? This is the axis of moral gravity. And this is the one culture confuses with masculinity. They are not the same. Moral load and overall masculine feminine are not the same. So, moral load is what remains inside a human system after betrayal, abandonment, failure, corruption, relational collapse, and unmet responsibility. It is the afterweight. It is what doesn't evaporate. Some nervous systems discharge that pressure outward. Some systems retain it internally. Some convert it into action. Some convert it into memory. This framework identifies which archetype retains weight and which releases it. That is the entire architecture. So there are two fundamental nervous system types. There's retention systems. So the higher moral load bearers, so it'd be tier 1 and 2 are the highest moral load bearers. They are retention systems. You can also include tier 3 in that as well. But retention nervous systems with moral weight bearing. They keep weight, they carry after the moment ends, they replay, they store, they metabolize responsibility internally or relationally. They feel implicated even when no one assigns blame. So these systems become the stabilizers, the conscience carriers, the emotional infrastructure, and the accountability anchors. They don't opt in, they are the container. Motion systems, so we are in tier 4. Those are the motion system nervous systems, including Gemini or the ENTJ. So motion nervous systems, they move energy, they discharge, they reframe, they pivot. They act, express, narrate, philosophize, or redirect. They experience stress and then release it. They do not retain moral residue long term. These systems become initiators, disruptors, storytellers, explorers, identity movers, and belief carriers. They are not designed to store moral weight. They are designed to move systems forward. All right, so is there anything else I want to say about tier 4? Okay, so we have Aries, Leo, Libra, Sag, Aquarius, and Gemini as the motion nervous system archetypes. So these regulate by movement, they externalize stress, they release responsibility, they pivot psychologically, they do not retain moral residue. They regulate through action, belief, identity, abstraction, and narrative. So they move energy instead of storing it. All right, so these archetypes are not built to store moral pressure, they are built to circulate it. That single distinction explains almost every relational mismatch between tier 4 types and tier 1 and 2 types. So where high load archetypes internalize consequence, tier 4 archetypes externalize process. They move energy instead of retaining it. So they convert tension into action Aries, expression and identity Leo, dialogue and rebalancing Libra, belief systems and meaning making Sagittarius, abstraction, systems and detachment with Aquarius, and narrative and reframing with Gemini. They do not sit inside unresolved pressure, they redirect it. They do not carry moral weight forward across time, they reset. That is their design. All right, so sorry, my throat's driving me insane. I want to go through Gemini very briefly. Okay, so Gemini is the contextual lightweight. I'm gonna have to get a drink of water. I've got allergies. All right, so Gemini is the contextual lightweight. Moral weight location is information and adaptability. Gemini experiences morality situationally. Responsibility shifts with context. Guilt dissolves through reframing. It depends. Burnout risk is minimal, misread as shallow and unreliable. Gemini reframes. Responsibility dissolves through context. They do not retain moral residue unless highly developed. Lightest load. So Gemini discharges through narratives and perspective. Gemini talks it out. They restory events. They find alternative interpretations. I literally just dealt with this last Friday. I'm going to try not to tear into Gemini. I'm trying so hard. All right, we're doing good. We're doing great. They move attention. They don't retain emotional gravity. They shift frames. Breathe in, breathe out. All right. So I'm going to take this key card off. Actually, I'm going to get back to where I need to be for the next section, which is like way up here. Give me one moment. Apologize. I'm going to set myself up for not failing. I'm going to get back to where I need to be. All right, Gemini. So we got a lot to talk about, Gemini. All right, so that is coming. All right, so this is still the introduction. All right, so masculine, feminine axis, Gemini sits at what? Number 8, the androgynous bridge, moral load bearer, number 12 out of 12. So when you combine low polarity anchoring with low moral retention, you get a system that is highly intelligent, highly adaptive, and highly responsive. Gemini, but fundamentally unanchored if it does not develop identity over time. Gemini can process everything and still not know what it stands on. And this is where the contrast with Aquarius becomes critical because Aquarius was right but mistimed. It saw too early, defined too early, and acted too late. Gemini is different. Gemini is in motion but unanchored. It does not wait, it does not delay, it is already moving, already processing, already engaging. The issue is not timing, it is direction. Aquarius struggles because it lived ahead of reality. Gemini struggles because it lives inside reality without stabilizing itself. So I want to go even more deeply into explaining the polarity position, tier 4 androgynous. Masculine through feminine axis, deep structure, lived experience, and distortion. I'm honestly very briefly, I'm going to make this smaller for a moment just to give myself some more space. All right, so on the masculine and feminine axis, Gemini sits in tier 4, ranked number 8 overall, which places it in the androgynous bridge. This is not a neutral position, it is a dynamic one. Jekyll and Hyde, there you go. I know I'm not going to get personal. Don't get personal. Jekyll and Hyde. Jekyll and Hyde, Gemini. Y'all, that is your Gemini for you. Jekyll and Hyde. You never know what you're going to get. Okay, I'm not going to tear into Gemini. Okay. All right, we're good. I'm number 2. What is it? Scorpio. Give me 3. I'm number 3 masculine in my mind. And so Gemini, I'm sorry, the males drive me insane. All right, so on the masculine feminine axis, Gemini sits in tier 4, ranked number 8 overall, which places it in the androgynous range. This is not a neutral position, it is a dynamic one. Gemini does not naturally anchor into masculine direction or feminine receptivity. It moves between them fluidly, often unconsciously, depending on the environment, the people involved, and the demands of the moment. This gives Gemini a unique kind of versatility, but it also removes something that other archetypes rely on for stability: a consistent default position under pressure. In real life, this looks like a person who can take charge in one moment and then become highly receptive in the next without a clear internal shift marking the transition. Gemini can lead a conversation, organize a situation, or drive momentum externally, and then just as quickly become adaptive, responsive, and open to influence. It reads the room, adjusts, recalibrates, and moves accordingly. This is why Gemini often appears socially intelligent and easy to engage with. It meets people where they are. But this same flexibility creates a deeper issue. Because when a system does not default consistently in one direction, it also does not hold direction automatically. Gemini can initiate but may not sustain. It can receive but may not anchor. Gemini can express but may not stand on what it expressed. So when they are talking to you, they are talking to hear themselves talk. It is not with conviction, it is literally with playful, I just want to talk. So instead of building continuity, it builds adaptability. From the outside, others often experience Gemini as engaging, quick, intelligent, and highly present, but inconsistent over time. Someone might feel deeply understood in one interaction, only to feel like that same understanding didn't carry forward into the next. Gemini can mirror well. So, Geminis are also the mirrors. Respond well and connect in the moment, but that connection does not always stabilize into something that holds. This is where people start to say things like, "You're different every time I talk to you. I don't know where you actually stand. You get it, but you don't stay with it." And that feedback can be confusing for Gemini because internally it is being real in each moment. That is the key. Gemini is not being fake. It is being contextually real, not structurally consistent. And that difference is everything. From Gemini's internal experience, this often feels like fluidity rather than instability. It feels like responsiveness. It feels like intelligence adapting to reality as it unfolds. Gemini does not experience itself as inconsistent. It experiences itself as accurate to the moment. So when others expect continuity across time, Gemini can feel misunderstood, even unfairly judged. But when Gemini begins to realize, especially as they mature, is that truth that only exists in moments does not build anything that lasts. Because reality is not only lived in moments, it is built across time. So the weakness of the androgynous position is not lack of capability, it is lack of directional retention. Gemini can move in any direction, but without anchoring, it cannot sustain one long enough to build identity, trust, or long term impact. And that strength, when integrated, Gemini becomes one of the most adaptable and effective communicators in any system because it is not locked into one polarity and they can understand both. Gemini can translate between them. Gemini can bridge people, ideas, and environments that they do not naturally connect. It becomes a mediator, a strategist, a connector of systems that would otherwise remain separate, but only after Gemini learns to hold a position long enough to build from it. All right, so I want to expand out the moral load tier 4 motion system. All right, so on the moral load bearing axis, Gemini sits at number 12, tier 4, is a full motion nervous system. This means Gemini does not process moral weight through retention. It processes it through movement. Gemini encounters something, they process it, and then they move on. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of Gemini. Because from the outside, it can look like Gemini does not care, does not feel deeply, or does not take things seriously. But that is not what is happening. Gemini does feel, they do it, but they do not hold. Moral weight does not settle in the system, it passes through it. In real life, this means Gemini can engage in complex, even heavy situations, understand them quickly, respond intelligently, and then appear relatively unaffected shortly after. Gemini can have a deep conversation, process emotional or ethical complexity in real time, and then shift into something else without lingering. For example, Gemini might have a serious discussion about a conflict, fully understand both sides, articulate the issue clearly, and even offer solutions. But after the conversation ends, Gemini may not continue carrying that weight internally. They move forward, the situation is processed, and the system releases it. To others, this can feel like, did that not matter to you? How are you just okay now? You moved on too fast. I have PTSD from Gemini. I've got mad PTSD from my ex. Like, Gemini, oh my God. All right, I'm good. We're all good. I'm not going to go into off the railing. This is so true. This is real. I've experienced this in real life. I'm not saying all Geminis are terrible. Not all male Geminis are terrible. I'm not saying that at all. All right, let's keep to the foundation. All right, but internally, Gemini is not dismissing the situation. Have already processed it. The system is designed to keep moving, and this is where both the strength and the distortion live. The strength is that Gemini can hold complexity without becoming overwhelmed. They can move through difficult information, conflicting perspectives, and high stimulation environments without getting stuck. They do not freeze under pressure. They do not collapse under weight easily. They keep going. This makes Gemini highly effective in fast-moving, high-demand situations where others might shut down. But the distortion is that what is processed is not always integrated, because integration requires some level of retention, and Gemini releases before that retention fully forms. So, consequences, lessons, and emotional realities may be understood, but not always anchored. This can show up in repeated patterns. Gemini may encounter a situation, understand it, move through it, and then later encounter something similar again, not because they didn't understand the first time, but because they didn't hold it long enough to build internal structure from it. So the issue is not lack of conscience, it is lack of moral retention. From Gemini's internal experience, this feels like resolution. The system processes something, finds coherence, and then releases tension. They do not It does not feel like avoidance, it feels like completion. But from the outside, it can feel like incompletion because others may still be carrying the weight that Gemini has already released. So, what Gemini gains from understanding this? When Gemini understands both of these axes, its androgynous polarity and its motion based moral system, something critical happens. They stop trying to fix the wrong problem. Gemini does not need to become less intelligent. They do not need to slow down unnaturally. They do not need to force themselves into a rigid identity prematurely. What they need is sequencing and retention. They begin to recognize when they are shifting polarity instead of holding direction, when they are processing instead of integrating, when they are understanding without selecting, when they are moving without building. And that awareness creates choice. Gemini can begin intentionally holding a position longer that feels natural. Holding a conversation thread, holding a decision, holding a value, holding a commitment. Not forever, but long enough for them to become real. Gemini can also begin slowing the release of moral weight just enough to ask, what is this building in me? Not just, what is this? That single shift begins turning motion into structure. I'm listening to heavy music. I got to put that song on repeat. All right, heavy music for this Gemini video. I'm going to start headbanging here in a minute. I'm just kidding. All righty, so that single shift begins turning motion into structure. All right, so what cross watchers can gain from dealing with Geminis or ENTJs? For people interacting with Gemini, this framework changes everything because now Gemini's behavior stops looking like inconsistency or lack of care and starts making structural sense. You begin to understand Gemini is not ignoring you. They processed faster than you expected. Gemini is not fake, it is contextually adaptive. Gemini is not careless. They do not retain weight the same way you do. Gemini is not avoiding, it is moving. And this allows for better interaction. Instead of expecting Gemini to naturally hold things the way a retention based system would, you can ask them to clarify their position over time, check for continuity, not just understanding, slow interactions down when needed, and reinforce what matters repeatedly so it anchors. And most importantly, you stop misreading movement as absence. And it's really fascinating to me. The Geminis that I know, yeah, all right. So I'm trying so hard not to get personal, but I lived on a road when I was with my ex Gemini. This road literally had Gemini males with a different female archetype. Multiple. Okay, now I'm going to do this in order. There was a Gemini married to a Cancer. So the Gemini, all these Geminis are males. Gemini married to a Cancer female. I was with the Gemini, coming from my Aquarian Mercury, high masculine. Anyways, let's see. The next house over, Gemini married to a Scorpio. Next one, Gemini married to this one doesn't really the Aries. I don't know how they're doing. But the other one, so the most percentage. So anyways, the last Gemini married to a Capricorn. So you've got Capricorn, Scorpio, Aquarius, Cancer. So excluding most of my system, my personality is 85% Capricorn. So I would frame this as more of myself being more Capricornian in a relationship because I have a stellium in Capricorn, moon, all of my outer planets, my midheaven. I'm a very high moral load bearer overall, and I'm very number one masculine. So what I'm trying to say is, from my own personal life experience, I have noticed Geminis tend to go for high retention, high moral load bearers. They pass responsibility and consequence off to their partners. Just letting you know. Just letting you know. Alrighty then. So I'm glad I got that out of my system. I'm going to feel so much better after this. Like, I have so much to say, and it's like so. I have so much information to say that each time I get a video done, it's such a huge relief. Like, good golly, I know that this is going to help someone. I wish I had this many years ago. You're probably not going to hear this anywhere else. So anyways, so the final synthesis, Gemini is one of the most capable systems when it comes to engaging reality. Gemini can understand quickly, adapt instantly, communicate clearly, navigate complexity in real time. But its two core challenges sit right at the foundation. They do not default in direction, and they do not naturally retain moral weight. So without awareness, everything they do remains in motion. And motion alone does not build identity or character or values or standing strong in what you say, commitments. But when Gemini learns to hold what it moves through, to anchor what it understands, to choose what they engage with, and to retain what matters, they become one of the few archetypes capable of not just navigating reality, but organizing it in real time while actually building something that lasts. All right. So if you don't explicitly connect the overall masculine and feminine axis and the moral load-bearing axis back into the quadrants, you will understand people in pieces individually, but you won't understand how the architecture actually behaves in a real human nervous system. So the key thing to establish is this: the overall masculine and feminine axis tells you the archetype's dominant directional style under pressure. It tells you whether the system tends to move by projecting structure outward, receiving and integrating inward, or shifting between those modes. In other words, it tells you the global posture of the system. The moral load axis tells you something different. It tells you where consequence stays, how long it remains active, whether the system retains pressure internally or discharges it through movement, reframing, identity, dialogue, or abstraction. In other words, it tells you the weight behavior of the system. And the quadrants tell you something more local and more mechanical. So the inner and outer feminine, masculine and feminine quadrants. They show you how the system performs those functions step by step. So give me one moment. I am going to readjust my key card here to include all three. Oh, there we go. Okay, good. All right, so so we're including the inner and outer masculine now. I just really wanted to hammer the overall masculine and feminine because Gemini is the only androgynous bridge. You never know what you're going to get with the twins, Jekyll and Hyde. Are they going to be masculine or feminine in any given moment? You just never know what you're going to get with Gemini. So it can be quite a wild ride. Never again on my end. Never again. Not romantically ever again. I can't tell you that right now. All right, so and the quadrants tell you something more local and more mechanical. They show you how the system performs those functions step by step. They tell you where perception happens, where containment happens, where definition happens, and where action happens. In other words, the quadrants show you the internal workflow of the psyche. So the axes and the quadrants are not competing models. They are three different scales of the same system. The overall masculine and feminine axis is the global directional bias. The moral load axis is the global consequence style. The quadrants are the local sequence mechanics that produce both. So that's the first thing to lock in. So an archetype's place on the masculine and feminine axis does not tell you every detail of how it processes. It tells you the overall direction of force. Does it initiate structure, hold structure, absorb and integrate, or move fluidly between those states? It tells you what the system tends to trust under pressure. Does it trust action, containment, relational exchange, internal structure, or external enforcement? That is the macro layer. An archetype's place on the moral load-bearing axis also does not tell you the full sequence. It tells you what happens after consequence enters the system. Does the weight stay? Does it become memory? Does it become guilt, duty, emotional burden, relational responsibility, or structural conscience? Or does it move? Does it discharge into action, philosophy, abstraction, identity, or narrative? This is also a macro layer, but it is tracking a different variable. The quadrants explain how those macro tendencies are built. Because every archetype still has to do the same four jobs. It has to perceive, it has to process and contain. Okay, so I'm going to take this down. I'm going to rearrange some things quickly because we're starting to get into a different section here. Oh, wait, no. Actually, I'm going to leave that over here for now. I don't know what I'm going to do, honestly. I kind of want... Okay, so I'm going to bring this up because we're going to go through... All right, so this is actually what I've been doing in the other videos. So I'm gonna make that relatively decently big so you can read it. And then Gemini, I'm going to move myself over here. All right. So I like the way that is. Let me make Gemini just a little bit. Okay. Move myself. All right. Okay, so we're going to be breaking this down. All right, so every archetype has to do the same four jobs. It has to perceive, it has to process and contain, it has to define what something means, and it has to act. Those functions never disappear. What changes is which quadrant gets overtrusted, which one gets delayed, and how early the system begins discharging weight instead of metabolizing it. So this is where the interaction becomes clear. The overall masculine and feminine axis influences which quadrants feel safest or strongest first. A highly masculine leading archetype will usually trust outward structuring, directional action, or firm definition more quickly. Actually, I'm not. I'm like ready to move into the next, but I'm actually not ready to move into the next. So I'm going to keep this up here for one moment. Okay. So a highly masculine leading archetype. So you've got Capricorn. You can see it, right? All right. A highly masculine, hopefully. Geez, is it big enough? There you go. You can screenshot that at your heart's pleasure. A highly masculine leading archetype will usually trust outward structuring, directional action, or firm definition more quickly. A more feminine leading archetype will usually trust attunement, integration, emotional continuity, or relational processing first. An androgynous or bridge archetype may move between these states fluidly but struggle to hold one long enough to create continuity. So that means the masculine and feminine axis gives you the style of the sequence, while the quadrants show you the order of the sequence. Then the moral load bearing axis tells you what happens inside that sequence once pressure enters the nervous system. All right, so actually, it's so nice to have visuals. I do apologize. I'm going to actually keep this here. Okay, so this, where was I? The moral load bearing axis tells you what happens inside that sequence once pressure enters. If an archetype is high in moral load, the weight tends to stay in one or more quadrants longer. It is not discharged quickly. It accumulates. It becomes burden, duty, vigilance, conscience, or emotional residue. If an archetype is low in moral load, the weight does not stay as long. It is moved, reframed, acted out, translated, or distributed before it settles into identity or long term internal burden. So the moral load axis tells you how long each quadrant is likely to carry consequence before release. This is why the three maps must be read together. The masculine and feminine axis tells you how force moves. The moral load axis tells you how consequence stays or moves. The quadrants tell you where and in what order all of that happens. For example, you can have an archetype that is relatively masculine leading, but low in moral retention. So all of the fire signs, for example, Aries, Leo, Sagittarius, higher on masculine overall. All of them are in tier 4 motion nervous systems. They don't hold moral weight. So that means the system may project direction strongly, act quickly, or define firmly, but not actually retain the emotional or moral residue of consequence for long. Aries is the clearest example of that pattern: strong direction, low moral retention. Action resolves pressure quickly. So when you read the quadrants of a system like that, you expect early action, early discharge, and relatively weak long-term containment. You can also have an archetype that is more feminine leading, but high in moral retention. That means the system may not project force outward strongly, but it carries emotional, relational, or ethical residue deeply and over time. Cancer or the ENFJ is a clear example there. The system may lead with attunement and care, so very feminine overall, but the moral weight stays, high moral load bearer. So when you read the quadrants, you expect early reception, deep internal containment, and slow release of burden. You can also have an archetype like Aquarius, which is masculine leaning overall, but low in moral retention. That means the system leads with structure and internal directional patterning, but it does not store consequence the way a high retention system would. It discharges through understanding. So the quadrants reveal exactly where that happens. Perception enters internally, Definition comes early, connection comes late, action comes even later, and moral weight gets abstracted before it fully settles. And then you have Gemini, which is androgynous overall and lowest in moral retention. That means the system is highly fluid in directional style and extremely low in sustained moral weight retention. So the quadrants reveal a system that engages first, processes through movement, explores widely, and only later attempts internal anchoring. The axis told you the broad story, the quadrants show you the mechanism. This also explains why people often confuse masculine and feminine with moral responsibility. They are not the same thing. Masculine and feminine tells you the direction of force. Moral load tells you the retention of consequence. All right, so you can be highly masculine, still low in moral retention. You can be feminine and carry crushing moral burden. You can be androgynous and unstable because nothing holds long enough. You can be quiet externally but carry immense internal consequence. This is why the quadrants matter so much. They stop people from flattening the archetype into one axis. Because once you see the quadrants, you realize that every archetype contains all four functions of human processing. No one is just masculine or just feminine. No one is just high load or just low load. The question is how those elements are sequenced, which one dominates first, and where the pressure gets retained or discharged. So, a good way to understand this, the overall masculine and feminine tells us which direction the system tends to move under pressure, the moral load, whether the weight of consequence stays in the system or moves it. And the quadrants tells us exactly where that pressure enters, how it gets processed, when it gets defined, and whether it gets carried or discharged through action, relation, identity, or abstraction. That is the bridge. The axis gives you the archetype's macro bias. The quadrants gives you its micro mechanics. All righty. Hammer, hammer, hammer. Hammer, hammer. All right, so am I an hour in yet? Holy crud muffins, I am. All right, so now we're going to move into the quadrants finally. What page am I on? I'm going to guess I have 20 more pages. Nope, 30. I have 31 more pages to go. All right. Jeez. All right, so we're moving into the quadrants. So I am going to pull up the key card and go through breaking down each section here first of all, because that's where we should start. All right, I can't get comfy. All right, here we go. We're in it. We're doing it. Are you doing it? All right, we're doing it. All right, so now we can move inside the system itself, because this is where Gemini becomes visible and how it actually processes reality. I really, truly hope this is big enough. There we go. All right, so, and just like Aquarius, the issue is not intelligence, it is sequence. But Gemini's sequence is built on motion. It engages first, then processes, then explores, and only at the very end does it attempt to stabilize. So every quadrant develops on top of movement instead of containment. All right, so I am going to go through this other key card briefly. So Gemini is the cognitive execution survival order. So we are talking about the distortion order. They engage with OM, outer masculine, TE hero and Mercury, then pattern with NI parent and North node with their inner feminine. Then they explore with SE child and Jupiter in left field. And then they work on their identity and values late with FI inferior and south node in fall in my system. So this quadrant, the outer masculine quadrant with TE hero and Mercury ruling Gemini, represents execution, communication, and environmental organization. Gemini begins in outer masculine. This is the most important thing to understand first because Gemini does not enter reality through quiet observation, internal values, or emotional containment. They enter through action, communication, and external processing. They think out loud, they organize while speaking, they build temporary coherence through movement. Gemini does not wait to fully understand reality before engaging with it. They engage reality in order to understand it. This is what makes Gemini fast. Not just intellectually fast, but structurally fast in real time. They can enter a conversation, identify moving parts quickly, reorganize information on the fly, and keep multiple ideas in motion at once. They're one of the most externally responsive archetypes in the system because they do not build from stillness. They build from engagement. All right, so function, cognitive function, and planetary breakdown. TE Hero organizes reality into workable systems, prioritizes execution, structure, responsiveness, and utility. Ask, what do I do with this right now? TE gives Gemini live ordering capacity. They do not want information sitting still. They want it moving, structured, and usable. Mercury governs communication, language, processing speed, and cognitive exchange. Enhances mental agility, verbal responsiveness, and rapid translation. Mercury asks, how do I articulate and connect this in real time? My contacts are getting blurry. That's awful. I'm going to turn my space heater down. It might be melting my contacts to my eyeballs. All right. So, Mercury asks, how do I articulate and connect this in real time? Mercury makes Gemini fast, verbal, adaptive, and externally cognitively fluid. Gemini engages reality through speech, movement, and external processing. They do not build clarity first and then act. They act in order to build clarity. So the distortion point, because Gemini begins in outer masculine, they can confuse processing with decision. They can organize in real time. Without ever anchoring into a true internal stance. Movement creates temporary coherence, but not necessarily stable identity. This is where overprocessing replaces selecting and activity replaces commitment. All right, so then Gemini can look decisive because they are very active, but activity is not always direction. Talking just to talk, moving just to move. All right, inner feminine quadrant with NI parent and north node in exaltation. This quadrant represents internal patterning, trajectory awareness, and hidden direction tracking. Once Gemini has engaged reality, they turn inward, not to stabilize emotionally, but to track where everything is going. This is the hidden layer beneath the movement. Gemini is not just reacting randomly. They also track trajectory beneath motion. They see patterns across events, recognize direction underneath scattered input, and begins understanding how one thing leads to another. But because this comes after engagement instead of before it, the patterning is layered on top of constant external motion. So instead of reducing options, they can multiply them. Gemini sees not one outcome, but many, not one path, but several. And this is where hesitation begins, not because Gemini is slow, but because they can see too many possible directions at once. So function and planet breakdown. NI parent perceives trajectories, implications, hidden direction, and long-term pattern flow. Ask, where is this going beneath the movement? NI gives Gemini its hidden strategic layer. They are not just reacting, they are mapping. North Node in exaltation points towards developmental direction, future alignment, and where the system is meant to grow. Adds pressure towards meaning, path, and future orientation. North Node gives Gemini a subtle pull towards deeper trajectory and purpose, even when the surface system is scattered. Gemini tracks direction beneath movement. It does not just process events, it begins seeing how events connect. So, distortion point, because Gemini sees multiple possible futures at once, they can remain in internal pattern tracking too long after external engagement. This creates over patterning, hesitation, and difficulty committing to one path. Gemini is not confused by lack of options, they are burdened by excess options. They do not lack vision, they struggle to reduce vision into commitment. So, outer feminine quadrant with SE child and Jupiter in left field represents experimental engagement, expansion through action, and environmental testing. After engaging in patterning, Gemini moves back outward again, but this time through exploration. This is where it tests reality through experience. Gemini tries things, enters spaces, samples possibilities, and expands through contact. Gemini does not merely think about reality, they experiment with it. This gives Gemini tremendous adaptability. They can move between people, settings, ideas, and opportunities with ease. They can learn quickly through exposure. They can gather data through lived interaction. This is why Gemini often appears versatile, socially fluid, and mentally expansive. They do not need one lane to function. They can engage in many. But without an internal anchor, this expansion becomes scattered. Experience accumulates but does not always consolidate. Gemini can try many things without choosing one. They can engage in many directions without following through on any of them long enough to anchor their identity. So, chasing all of the rabbits at once and catching none. Function and planet breakdown. SE child engages through direct experience, immediacy, novelty, and contact with the external world. Ask, what happens if I just try this? So this does make them mechanically inclined as well as intellectually inclined. So SE asks, what happens if I just try this? SE gives Gemini experimentation, spontaneity, and real world sampling. Jupiter in left field represents expands experience, possibility, movement, and breadth. Adds optimism, openness, exploration, and appetite for more. Jupiter makes Gemini expansive, curious, and willing to test multiple realities. Gemini explores through action. They learn through trying, moving, and exposing themselves to what is available. Distortion point, because this exploration comes before stable identity, Gemini can expand without consolidating. They can become overstimulated, scattered, impulsive, and inconsistent in follow through. The system keeps moving, but nothing locks into selfhood. Gemini can experience a lot without building much from it. Then we have the inner masculine quadrant with FI inferior and the south node in my system. This quadrant represents internal values, identity grounding, and moral stance formation. This is the final and weakest layer in Gemini, and it is the core instability of the entire system. Gemini does not define themselves first. They define themselves last. Internal values, stable identity, and clear personal stance are delayed. This means Gemini can understand many systems, many perspectives, many people, and many arguments without having a strong internal anchor of their own. This is not because Gemini lacks depth, it is because identity was not the entry point of this system. Whew, man, Gemini's polar opposite is Sagittarius. Sagittarius has FE inferior. Gemini has FI inferior. I need to make that into its own video. All All right. So, anyway, the system was built to engage, process, track, and explore first. So, by the time they reach inner masculine, there's already a great deal of movement and information, but not necessarily a fixed reference point. This is where Gemini struggles the most. Not with intelligence, not with capability, but with self definition. They may shift depending on context, may absorb external values without fully noticing. They may understand what everyone else thinks while remaining unclear on what they actually believe in themselves. All right, so function and planet breakdown. I've got my big bay door open and it's like starting to get more windy and raining. All right, so FI inferior forms internal values, personal truth, and stable emotional moral orientation. Ask what is true for me, regardless of context. FI is where Gemini struggles most because it requires stillness, selection, and sustained internal reference. The south node represents indicates prior familiarity, default tendencies, and overused or inherited patterns. Can reinforce fallback loops instead of forward development. South node here can make Gemini rely too heavily on familiar movement, external processing, or adaptive identity instead of developing deeper internal grounding. Gemini reaches identity late. They do not naturally begin with values. They discover them slowly if they stop moving long enough to build them. So, distortion point, this is where identity drift happens. Gemini may adapt external values, shift moral stance depending on environment, or remain inconsistent in what they stand on. I've been saying this for years at this point. Gemini literally is on top of the fence. They don't take a side. They're on everyone's side. Like they are the biggest pot stirrer. All right. I've been good. All right, so this is where identity drift happens. Gemini may adapt external values, shift moral stance depending on environment, or remain inconsistent in what they stand on. Without stable inner masculine, the whole system remains adaptive but unanchored. Gemini does not always lack belief. They often lack sustained internal commitment. So their distortion order is outer masculine, inner feminine, inner masculine. Engage, pattern, explore, and values late or identity. Gemini enters reality through action, then tracks patterns beneath motion, then expands through experience, and only later attempts to stabilize into values and identity. Gemini does not define themselves first. They discover themselves through processing. So what others experience? You say a lot, but I don't know where you actually stand. You adapt to everything, but I can't tell what's really you. You're always moving, but I don't know what you're building. You understand every side, but you won't choose one. Gemini can feel brilliant, responsive, and alive, but also hard to anchor. All right. So that was my brief breakdown. And now I'm going to leave this up here. All right. Now then. Where am I at? Key card. There we go. Make this a little bit smaller. All right, so I'm going to keep this up here, but I'm going to make it a little bit smaller just so it's still there for referencing. All right, I need a drink. I'm like losing my voice. All right. I need to bang out this video so I can make one more and then start working on my darn book. Like, I've got most of it outlined and edited. Not even most. I would say probably like 30, 40%. I'm probably like 40% done. All right. Anyway. All right. So, where are we starting? Outer masculine. My nose itches. Oh, gosh. Allergies are so freaking bad. All right. And outer masculine. Gemini enters reality through execution, communication, and real-time organization. Gemini speaks, structures, and processes externally as things are happening. This is where they appear fast, sharp, and highly capable. They can organize conversations instantly, track multiple inputs, and create temporary structure out of chaos. This is one of the most externally efficient systems in the within the archetypes. So moral weight in this quadrant moves immediately through action. Gemini does not sit with tension, they process it out loud. If something is wrong, they talk through it. If something is unclear, they organize in real time. The system relieves pressure by engaging with it. But the distortion is that processing replaces decision making. Gemini may speak extensively without choosing a position. They may organize without committing. They may respond quickly but inconsistently. The system is active but not anchored. So reintegration here is about interrupting automatic execution just long enough to introduce direction. Gemini begins pausing before responding, not to stop movement, but to align it. This is where Gemini, okay, so yes, this is where Gemini appears fast, capable, and highly intelligent. They can track multiple inputs at once, organize conversations in real time, and bring temporary structure to the chaotic environments. That strength here is undeniable. They can move information quickly, adapt instantly, and respond without hesitation. So, this is where moral load begins to move, and it moves immediately. Gemini does not hold tension at the point of entry. They process it through action. If something is off, I think I repeated myself. So moral weight in this quadrant is discharged through communication and execution. The system feels relief not by holding the issue, but engaging with it. And this is where the distortion forms, because when execution comes before internal anchoring, processing replaces decision making. Gemini may talk through something extensively without ever actually choosing a position. They may organize a situation repeatedly without committing to a direction. They may respond quickly, but not consistently. So after 30, this becomes more noticeable because Gemini begins to see how often they have been active without being anchored. They may look back on situations where they said a lot, did a lot, and engaged consistently, but never actually decided. Conversations where they processed in real time but left without a clear stance. Actions that created movement but not resolution. And this is where the first correction begins. So this is reintegration here is not about slowing Gemini down completely. It is about interrupting automatic execution long enough to check alignment. Gemini begins to notice the impulse to speak, to respond, to organize immediately, and instead of following it instantly, they pause briefly, not to stop movement, but to introduce direction into it. They begin to ask, what am I actually doing here? Before continuing to act. And over time, this changes execution from constant motion into intentional movement. All right, so ages 1 through 12. This is when we are working on the outer masculine with Gemini, T hero and Mercury ruling Gemini. So Gemini does not develop like most archetypes. And if you try to understand it through stability, identity, or emotional continuity first, you're going to misread them from the beginning. Because Gemini does not start by asking who they are. They do not begin by forming a stable internal identity. They do not begin by anchoring into values or emotional consistency. Gemini begins by engaging. It enters reality through movement, through communication, through interaction. What is in front of them? They speak, they organize, respond, and process in real time. And because of that, Gemini that things are learns what things are by interacting with them, not by defining them first. So that single difference changes everything about how the system develops. Because where other archetypes build identity and then move into the world, Gemini moves into the world and only later begins to build identity. They gather information before they select meaning. They explore before they commit. They process before they decide, and for a long time, that works extremely well. But over time, that same sequence begins to create instability because without an internal anchor, movement does not accumulate into selfhood. And that is where this entire developmental arc is about. All right, so ages 1 through 12, engagement before identity. In early childhood, Gemini presents as highly responsive, mentally active, and externally engaged. This is a child that is constantly interacting with their environment. They ask questions, they talk, observe, mimic, and organize what is happening in real time. They do not sit back and slowly process internally. They engage first and process through engagement. You will often see this child thinking out loud. They may narrate what they are doing, ask rapid fire questions, or jump quickly between topics. That is not distraction. People assume it is not distracted in the way people assume. So they process externally, organizing reality through communication. This is also where their strength becomes visible very early. Gemini can pick up patterns in language, behavior, and environment quickly because they are constantly interacting with them. They learn through exposure, they learn through movement, they learn by being in the system, not by observing the system from a distance. But at the same time, I need to move this. But at the same time, okay, there we go. But at the same time, something is not forming here that forms more naturally in other archetypes, and that is internal continuity. Because Gemini is not being trained to sit with one thing for extended periods. They're not being trained to stabilize internally before moving on. They are being rewarded for responsiveness, adaptability, and engagement. So they become very good at entering things, but not necessarily at staying with them. I just don't know what to do with myself here. All right, so you may see this in how quickly they shift attention. They can move from one activity to another, from one idea to another, from one interest to another without much resistance. This is not always a problem in early childhood. In fact, it can look like intelligence, curiosity, and versatility. But what is forming underneath that is a system that is comfortable moving without anchoring. And because identity has not begun to form yet, there is no internal reference point to organize all of that movement. So the child begins building a relationship to reality that looks like this. I understand things by interacting with them, not I understand things by becoming something first. So, real life expressions, strengths, and distortions here. So, in real life, a Gemini child is one of the easiest archetypes to spot once you know what you're looking for because the engagement is constant. This is not the child sitting quietly observing before acting. This is the child already talking, already asking, already moving, already interacting with everything in the environment. You will see them in a classroom where they raise their hand quickly, not because they fully thought something through, but because they are thinking through speaking. You will see them at home where they narrate what they're doing, ask questions after question, jump topics mid sentence, and circle back later as if nothing was lost. The thinking is happening out loud, in motion, in real time. So, for example, a parent might be cooking in the kitchen and the child is not just watching, they're asking what each ingredient does and why it's used. What would happen if it changed, and then suddenly shift into a completely different question about something they saw earlier that day. To someone who doesn't understand the system, it can look scattered or unfocused, but what's actually happening is live organization. The child is pulling in inputs, connecting them, and processing externally. The environment is not separate from their thinking, it is their thinking space. So, pause one moment. This is not just about the ego, the sun sign of Gemini. If you are a Gemini Mercury, Moon, rising. Um, if you have like a stellium in Gemini, this information certainly applies to you. My little girl, obviously, Gemini rising. And so, yeah, Gemini. Cheers. All right. So, um, the environment is not separate from their thinking, it is their thinking space. So in school, this child often stands out as verbally quick and mentally agile. They may grasp concepts fast, especially with those concepts are explained interactively. They do well in environments where they can engage, respond, and participate. They might be the student who answers quickly, contributes often, or even talks excessively. Constant interruption, not because they lack discipline, but because silence actually interrupts their processing flow. When they are allowed to engage, they learn rapidly. When they are forced into stillness without interaction, their cognition can appear to drop off, even through though the capacity is still there. This is where the strength becomes very obvious early on. Gemini children are excellent at picking up patterns in language, tone, behavior, and environment because they are constantly in contact with them. They learn how people speak, how conversations flow, how reactions work, how social dynamics shift. They can mirror language styles, pick up humor quickly, and adapt to different styles of people with surprising ease for their age. They're often described as smart, quick, talkative, or curious. But what is really being observed is a system that is designed to process through engagement. All right, so what else do I want to talk about? All right. So this can show up in things like hobbies that rotate frequently, toys that are used intensely and then dropped, or interests that come and go in cycles. Again, in early childhood, this often looks like curiosity and exploration. And to a degree, it is. But what is being reinforced underneath is a pattern of movement without consolidation. Another place this becomes visible is in attention. Gemini children are often mislabeled as distracted, when in reality they are over engaged. Their attention is not absent, it is distributed. They're tracking multiple inputs at once, shifting between them quickly and processing across them in real time. The issue is not that they cannot focus, it is that they have not yet learned how to choose what to focus on and hold it there. So the weakness forming here is not lack of intelligence or lack of capability. It is lack of sustained internal reference. The child is learning, adapting, and engaging, but not organizing that engagement into a stable sense of self yet. So the relationship to reality becomes I understand things because I interact with them, but not yet I understand things because I hold them and build from them. And this is where development matters because the goal is not to shut down the engagement that would break the system entirely. Gemini needs movement to learn. They need interaction. They need communication. If you try to force this child into a purely still internal processing style, you will not make them more focused. You will make them less functional. The goal is to layer anchoring into movement, not replace movement with stillness. So, in real life, helping this child develop looks like guiding them to stay just slightly longer than they naturally would without removing their ability to engage. For example, if the child jumps between activities, instead of forcing them to stay indefinitely, you might say, finish this part first, then we'll move on. This creates a small unit of completion, not overwhelming, not restrictive, but enough to begin building continuity. Over time, those small completions start to stack, and the system begins to recognize what it feels like to carry something through. In communication, instead of shutting down their talking, you can redirect them into structure. If they're telling a story in a scattered way, you guide them gently back, start from the beginning, or what happened next. This does not silence their processing, it organizes it. It teaches them that movement can still have sequence. In learning environments, interactive engagement should be paired with light containment. Let them talk, ask, respond, but also bring them back to a central point. We're still on this part. This helps train the system to return, not just move forward endlessly. Another powerful way to support development is through reflection after engagement. After they experience something, instead of immediately moving on, you ask, what did you like about that? Or what did you learn from that? This begins building the bridge into the inner masculine later on. Alrighty. Yeah, definitely. Building the bridge into the inner masculine. So it introduces the idea that experience is not just something to pass through, it is something to extract meaning from. And most importantly, you do not label their movement as a problem because it isn't. It is the foundation of their intelligence. But without guidance, that movement stays horizontal. With the right guidance, it begins to stack vertically. All right. So, what you're doing in this stage is not slowing Gemini down. You're teaching them how to carry something forward while they move. Because if that doesn't begin here, then later in life, the system will know everything and still not know who they are. All right. So, we move into the inner feminine quadrant with NI parent and North Node in exaltation. An inner feminine Gemini moves inward after engagement, but not to stabilize. They move inward to track, to map, to understand trajectory. This is where they begin to recognize patterns beneath movement. They see where things are going, how they connect, and what outcomes are possible. This is where Gemini becomes highly perceptive in a different way than Aquarius. They do not see patterns before engagement. They see them after entering the system. So Aquarius leads with an I hero, unlike Gemini. So this is where moral load shifts into anticipation. Gemini begins to track potential consequences, possible outcomes, and multiple future directions at once. They can see how something might unfold across different paths, and this gives them a kind of predictive awareness that is extremely fast and flexible. But because this is still built on constant input, the system does not narrow, it expands. Instead of resolving, it multiplies. Gemini sees too many possibilities, too many directions, too many potential outcomes, and this creates hesitation, not from lack of intelligence, but from excess perception. The system cannot select because everything remains open. After 30, this begins to show up as overprocessing. Gemini may find themselves thinking through multiple versions of the same situation, anticipating different responses, different outcomes, different paths without ever choosing one. They may feel they understand everything that could happen but cannot lock into what will happen. And that creates a different kind of instability, not confusion, but diffusion. Reintegration here is about narrowing. Gemini begins learning how to let go of possibilities that are not being acted on. They do not need to track every outcome. They need to select one and move with it. This shows up as choosing a direction even when other options are still visible. This allows the system to reduce internal noise by committing to a path. And over time, pattern recognition becomes something that informs action instead of something that prevents it. All right, so we're talking about adolescence here, 12 through 20, give or take, 13 to 18, 12 to 20. Pattern awareness without anchoring. As Gemini moves into adolescence, the system becomes more complex. It is no longer just engaging reality. They are now beginning to track patterns within it. They start recognizing how people behave over time, how situations unfold, how different choices lead to different outcomes. This is where the inner feminine layer begins to come online more strongly. So now Gemini is not just interacting, they're also mapping. They begin seeing trajectories. They can anticipate how conversations will go, how social dynamics will shift, how certain behaviors will lead to certain results. This gives them a kind of social and cognitive awareness that can be very sharp. But because this patterning is layered on top of constant movement, it does not simplify the system, it complicates it. So they do not see one direction, they see many. So this is where hesitation begins, not because Gemini is slow, but because they see too much. All right, so they may know how to act in different environments, how to talk to different people, how to adjust their behavior depending on what is happening. And that adaptability becomes a strength socially. They can fit in multiple spaces, they can communicate across different groups, they can understand different perspectives. But internally, something is still missing. There is still no stable identity. So instead of selecting who they are, Gemini begins experimenting with who they could be. You may see this in shifting interests, shifting friend groups, shifting ways of speaking, even shifting values depending on environment. And this is not fake, it is exploratory. Gemini is trying on different structures in real time to see what fits. But because they do not yet have a strong internal anchor, nothing fully locks in. So the system becomes, increasingly complex, increasingly aware, and increasingly adaptive, but not necessarily more defined. So they are the odd man out of the FI, introverted feeling personality types. All right. I gotta do something. Okay. I had to check something real quick. All right. So, real life expression, strengths, distortions, and development. All right. So, we're talking about adolescence. In real life, Gemini in adolescence starts to look less like purely talkative or curious child and more like someone who is highly socially aware, mentally agile, and capable of navigating multiple environments with surprising ease. The engagement is still there, but now it is layered with pattern recognition. This is where you begin to see the system tracking people, tracking outcomes, tracking dynamics over time. You might see this in a school setting where Gemini can read a room almost instantly. They know who holds influence, who is reacting to who, what tone is working, and what tone is not. They may adjust how they speak depending on the teacher, the friend group, or the situation without consciously thinking about it. In one class, they may be structured and direct. In another, they may be humorous and loose. Around one group, they may be quiet and observant. Around another, they may be highly expressive. This is not random, it is responsive pattern tracking. In conversations, Gemini may begin finishing people's sentences, anticipating reactions before they happen, or steering interactions based on where they see them going. For example, in a disagreement, they may already know how the other person will respond and adjust their language to either escalate, diffuse, or redirect the conversation. This can make Gemini appear socially intelligent, even strategic, because they are no longer just reacting, they are predicting. This is where their strength becomes very sharp. Gemini can understand multiple perspectives at once. They can see how different people are interpreting the same situation. They can hold competing viewpoints without immediately rejecting one. They can navigate complex social environments, adapt quickly, and communicate in a way that keeps them included across different groups. This is where people often start describing Gemini as good with people, quick thinking, or able to fit anywhere. And this is accurate but incomplete because what is happening underneath that adaptability is not stability. It is multiplicity. Gemini is not becoming one thing. They're becoming many possibilities at once. And because inner masculine has still not stabilized, did I say inner masculine? Inner feminine, excuse me. Wait a minute. Did I put this in the wrong section? Hold on a second. Let's see, where was I? Did I skip a page? I hope not. Outer feminine. Oh, okay, so we're good. All right. Now I really actually think I did lose my spot again. Where am I? Okay. All right. So Gemini is not becoming one thing. I'm getting tired. I should probably cut this off, but I'm trying so hard to power through. I've got 20 more pages. Gemini is not becoming one thing. They're becoming many possible things at once. All right. So because inner feminine has still not stabilized, nothing is selecting which of those versions they actually are. So instead of identity forming, identity begins to branch. You may see this very clearly in how the adolescence shifts across environments. So, I think I hammered that pretty well. I'm going to start skipping some sections. Okay, so this is where hesitation begins to form, not externally at first, but internally. Because the more Gemini sees, the harder it becomes to choose. They may be asked a simple question like, what do you want to do? Or what do you think about this? And instead of answering quickly like they did in childhood, they pause, not because they don't understand, but because they see too many valid options. They know how each choice could play out. They understand the consequences of different directions, and instead of collapsing into one answer, they keep processing. So, what looks like indecision is actually overperception. Gemini is not lacking clarity, they are overloaded with it. This can also show up in interest and direction. The adolescents may move between hobbies, goals, or identities more fluidly. And that looks inconsistent and unstable. All right, so the weakest forming here is not lack of depth, it is lack of consolidation. All right, so the goal here is not to shut down adaptability. That would remove one of Gemini's greatest strengths. The goal is to begin introducing selection and consistency inside the movement. In real life, this looks like helping the adolescent start to notice patterns inside themselves, not just in others. Instead of only asking what is happening out there, you begin asking, what do you keep coming back to? Or what actually feels consistent for you across different situations? This begins shifting awareness inward without forcing it. For example, if Gemini expresses different opinions in different environments, instead of correcting it immediately, you may ask, out of everything you've said, what do you actually agree with the most? This encourages selection. It does not remove their ability to see multiple sides. It asks them to choose one to stand on, even temporarily. In social situations, you can help them notice when they are adapting versus when they are being consistent, not by criticizing the adaptation, but by bringing awareness to it. I notice you show up differently in different groups. What feels most like you? That question alone begins building inter-reference. In decision making, instead of overwhelming them with open ended choice, you can narrow the field slightly and then require a decision. Not perfectly, not permanently, but enough to practice committing. One of these two, pick one and try it for a while. This teaches a system that choosing does not eliminate other options forever, it just creates direction. Another powerful support is helping them follow through on something slightly longer than they naturally would. Not forcing long term commitment immediately, but extending duration. If they lose interest quickly, you guide them to stay just a little bit longer, long enough to experience depth instead of just entry. This is where identity begins forming, not at the start of something, but in staying with it. And most importantly, you help them understand that seeing multiple perspectives is a strength, but living without choosing one creates instability. Because Gemini does not need less awareness, they need a place for that awareness to land. So, what you are doing in this stage is not reducing options. You are teaching the system how to close around one option long enough to become something real. Because if that does not begin here, then later in life, Gemini will understand everyone and still not know where they stand. All right, so now we're going to move into the outer feminine with SE child and Jupiter in left field. In outer feminine, Gemini moves back outward again, but now through exploration instead of structure. This is where they test reality. They try things, engage socially, shifts environments, and gathers experience through movement. This is where Gemini becomes highly adaptive, highly curious, and highly expansive. They learn by doing, by interacting, by exposing themselves to different inputs. This is one of Gemini's most visible strengths. They can enter new environments quickly, adapt to different people, and gather a wide range of experiences. They're not limited by rigidity. They can move between context with ease. They can explore without hesitation. But this is also where moral load becomes scattered. Because without an internal anchor, exploration does not accumulate into direction. Gemini may move through many experiences without integrating them. They may try multiple paths without committing to any of them. They may connect with many people without forming deeper continuity. The system expands, but it does not consolidate. So this is where the the topicalness comes from. The lack of actual depth and commitment. Okay, anyways, after 30, this often shows up as fragmentation. Gemini may look back and see a wide range of experiences, but struggles to identify a consistent through line. They may feel like they have done a lot, seen a lot, and engaged with a lot, but not fully built something stable from it. And this is where the need for integration becomes clear. Reintegration here is about selective exploration. Gemini begins choosing where to invest their energy instead of engaging everywhere. They allow themselves to continue exploring, but with direction. They begin asking what is actually worth continuing instead of staying in consistent expansion. And over time, exploration becomes something that builds towards identity instead of replacing it. All right, early adulthood. So we are in 20 through 30, 35, depending on maturity. All right, expansion without consolidation. As Gemini enters early adulthood, the system becomes highly capable. This is where you see the full strength of their excuse me, their outer masculine and outer feminine working together. They can communicate clearly, organize ideas, adapt quickly, and engage with a wide range of environments. They can take in information, process it in real time, and respond effectively. They can explore different paths, try different roles, and move between opportunities with relative ease. This often looks like versatility. Gemini can succeed in multiple areas. They can pick up things quickly. They can navigate complexity without freezing. They can function in dynamic environments where others might struggle. But this is also where the core issue begins to show more clearly. Because while Gemini is expanding outward, they're not necessarily consolidating inward. They may start many things, but not finish them. They may explore many directions, but not choose one. They may understand multiple perspectives, but not commit to a personal stance. And over time, this creates a subtle instability. Not because not because Gemini is incapable, but because nothing is being held long enough to become identity. So you may see this in career paths, relationships, or personal direction. Gemini may pivot frequently, adjust course often, or remain in a state of figuring it out longer than other archetypes. And again, this is not due to lack of intelligence, it is due to sequence. The system is still prioritizing engagement and exploration over anchoring and selection. So life becomes full, but not always grounded. All right, so real life expressions, strengths, distortions, and development. All right, so in real life, Gemini in early adulthood often appears highly capable, highly functional, and in many cases ahead of their peers in terms of adaptability and real life problem solving. So, this is a person who can walk into a new job and understand the workflow almost immediately. They are extremely good at negotiating. I think I'm not even going to mention that personality. They can negotiate really well. Definitely give that to them. They're mechanically inclined. They can talk to whoever. They normally are in charge, honestly. They prefer to be in charge. Um, they may not have prior experience, but they can observe, ask questions, and begin organizing the system in real time. Within a short period, they often appear competent because they're not waiting to fully understand before engaging. Hands-on learning, literally. They are learning through doing, speaking, and interacting. They can troubleshoot on the fly. Seen it in real life. Explain things clearly and adapt to changing conditions without shutting down. You will also see this in social and relational environments. Gemini can navigate different groups, communicate across different personalities, and adjust their tone, language, and presence depending on context. They can hold conversations with different types of people and find common ground quickly. They often become the connector, the communicator, or the one who keeps things moving because they understand how to keep interaction flowing. So this is where their strength is undeniable. Gemini can handle complexity in motion. They can process information while acting. They can stay mentally flexible in environments that require constant adjustment. They can explore multiple paths without becoming immediately overwhelmed. And they often are one of the most versatile archetypes in this stage because they are not locked into one rigid structure. But this is also where the core issue becomes much more visible because now the stakes are higher. Earlier in life, movement without anchoring could be absorbed. There was time, there was flexibility, there were fewer consequences for changing direction. But in early adulthood, the system begins interacting with structures that require continuity: careers, long term relationships, financial responsibility, and personal direction. And this is where the gap starts to show. Because while Gemini is expanding outward, they are still not consolidating inward. You may see this in career paths where Gemini enters something quickly, performs well, understands the system, and then begins to lose interest or shift direction before depth is built. They're not It is not that they cannot succeed. In many cases, they succeed quickly. But once the system is understood, the stimulation decreases, and without an internal anchor to hold them where they are, they move. So the pattern becomes enter, learn, adapt, perform, disengage, repeat. From the outside, this can look like inconsistency or lack of discipline. But internally, Gemini is not experiencing failure. They're experiencing completion at the level they are wired for: engagement and understanding, not at the level required for long term development. You will also see this in decision making. Gemini may have multiple viable options: career paths, locations, relationships. USA. USA fraba. Okay, we're all good. I'm going to power through this. USA, let it out. Let it out. Gemini may have multiple viable options, career paths, locations, relationships, and instead of committing to one, they continue exploring. The grass is always greener, right? They keep doors open. They delay final decisions. They may say things like, I'm still figuring it out. Not because they lack direction, but because they see too many possible directions and has not yet built the mechanism to close around one. In relationships, this can show up as strong initial engagement followed by inconsistency. Gemini can connect, communicate, and engage deeply in the moment. They can understand the other person quickly, adapt to them, and build connection through interaction. But when the relationship requires stability, consistency, and long-term emotional positioning, the system may begin to feel constrained. Not because the relationship is wrong, it's not you, but because they require anchoring that has not fully developed. So, again, the weakness here is not lack of intelligence, lack of capability, or lack of opportunity. It is lack of sustained selection. Nothing is being held long enough to become identity. And over time, this creates a subtle but increasing instability. Life becomes full of experiences, full of interactions, full of partial builds, but not grounded. There's movement, but not always direction. There's understanding, but not always commitment. There's capability, but not always continuity. And this is where development becomes critical because at this stage, the system must begin transitioning from expansion into consolidation, not by stopping movement, but by choosing what the movement is building toward. In real life, helping Gemini at this stage looks like introducing commitment in a way that does not feel like restriction, but like direction. If you try to force rigid, permanent decisions too early, the system will resist or disengage. But if you frame commitment as a container for growth, it begins to land differently. For example, instead of saying, pick one thing and stick with it forever, you shift it to choose one thing and go deeper with it for a defined period. This creates a boundary that feels manageable. It allows Gemini to experience depth without feeling trapped. In career development, this might look like encouraging them to stay in a role long enough to move past the learning phase and into mastery, to experience what happens after the initial engagement, to see what it feels like to build something, not just understand it. This is where identity begins to form, not in entry, but in continuation. In decision making, it means reducing the number of open loops. Gemini tends to keep many options available, but this diffuses energy. So, development comes from closing some of those loops intentionally. Not all of them, but enough to create direction. Choosing one path does not eliminate all others permanently, but it creates a line that can actually be followed. In relationships, this looks like learning to stay present across time, not just in moments. Gemini already knows how to connect in the moment. The development is learning how to remain consistent between moments, showing up again, following through, maintaining presence even when stimulation drops. This is also an internal shift that needs to be supported here. Gemini must begin asking, not just what can I do or what do I understand, but what am I building? This question changes the entire orientation of the system. It moves from horizontal movement to vertical accumulation. And this is key because Gemini does not need less expansion. They need something that expansion can land on and build from. So, what you're doing in this stage is not slowing Gemini down. You are teaching how to turn movement into direction. Because if that does not begin here, then later in life, Gemini will have done everything and still feel like nothing fully became theirs. All right, last quadrant, page 38 of 51. All right, so last quadrant, inner masculine with FI inferior and south node in fall. Okay, so an inner masculine Gemini reaches the final quadrant, and this is where the system is meant to stabilize. This is where identity forms, where values lock in, where internal stance becomes clear. But because this comes last, it is the weakest and most delayed layer in the entire system. Gemini does not define themselves first. They define themselves. It won't let me do it. I had such a good song. Oh, yes, it will. Okay, sorry. I'm pushing replay on that song. All right, so Gemini may understand. Okay, Gemini does not define themselves first. They define themselves after everything else. And this is where the core instability lives. Gemini may understand multiple perspectives, multiple systems, multiple people, and multiple realities, and still not know what they believe in. They may be able to argue any side, adapt to any environment, and process any situation, but lack a fixed internal reference point. This is where moral load becomes most unstable, because without identity, there is nothing to anchor decisions to. Gemini may respond to situations effectively, but inconsistently. They may shift positions depending on context. They may adapt external values without fully integrating them internally. After 30, this becomes the central pressure point. Gemini begins to feel the cost of not having a stable identity. They may notice inconsistency in their decisions, direction, and long term commitments. They may feel like they are constantly adapting but not fully rooted anywhere. Reintegration here is the most important shift in the entire system. Gemini begins to define themselves deliberately. They choose values not based on what is most adaptive in the moment, but based on what they're willing to stand on consistently. They begin forming an internal anchor that does not change with every environment. This does not remove Gemini's adaptability, it gives them direction. And once this quadrant stabilizes, everything else reorganizes around it. All right, so the inferior cognitive function, we start working on this between ages 30, 35, give or take. So that's when this quadrant starts to kick online. So the identity gap becomes invisible. As Gemini approaches 30, something begins to shift. Saturn return. Bam, smack in the face. Sit down, Gemini. I'm just playing. All right, so not externally at first, internally, because up until this point, the system has been able to function through movement. It has been able to adapt, adjust, and navigate without needing to fully stabilize. But over time, patterns begin to repeat. Paths that were started do not fully develop. Relationships that were engaged do not fully deepen. Opportunities that were explored do not fully become anything. And this is where the system begins to feel something it has not had to face directly before: lack of anchoring. Gemini may begin to notice that they can do many things, understand many things, and move through many environments, but they're not fully rooted in any of them. There is a growing awareness that processing is not the same as choosing, that understanding is not the same as committing, that movement is not the same as direction. And this creates pressure, not because Gemini is failing, but because the system is reaching the point where identity can no longer be delayed without consequence. This is where inner masculine begins demanding development, not as an idea, but as necessity. So pre-30 pressure, so yeah, 30 to 35. Real life expressions, strengths, distortions, and development. In real life, this stage does not usually show up as an obvious collapse. Gemini often still looks capable from the outside. They are the most functional, non-functional human beings. Yes, it's a thing. They can still communicate well, adapt quickly, and move through environments with relative ease. They can still take on new opportunities, understand systems, and function at a high level dynamic. situations. If anything, they may appear like they're doing a lot, but internally something begins to shift. And it is subtle at first. It starts as a kind of quiet recognition that something is not holding. Gemini may begin to look back and notice patterns that were not visible before, not patterns in other people, not patterns in systems, but patterns in themselves. They may realize that they have entered multiple paths that never fully developed, that relationships were engaging but not deep, that they have understood many things, but they have not built anything that remains. For example, someone in this stage may look at their work history and see that they have moved through several roles, learned quickly in each, and performed well, but did not stay long enough to move into true mastery or long-term positioning. Or they may look at relationships and see the connection. That connection was present. Or they may look at relationships and see that connection was present, communication was strong, but continuity was inconsistent. The pattern is not failure, it is non-completion. And this is where the identity gap becomes visible. All right, so they start asking what is actually mine. This is where the internal pressure begins to build. Because up until this point, Gemini has been able to function through movement. They can adapt instead of commit. They could explore instead of choose, and they could process instead of define. And that worked until reality began requiring continuity. And now the system begins to recognize something very specific. That processing is not the same as choosing. The understanding is not the same as committing. All right, so this, I am fading away. My voice is fading away. Okay, so you may see this showing up in decision paralysis in areas that previously felt easy. Gemini may be faced with decisions about career, location, relationships, or long-term direction and find that they cannot resolve them the way they used to. Not because they lack information, but because they have too much of it. Every option makes sense. Every path is viable. Every perspective is understandable. And instead of creating clarity, that creates pressure. Because now the cost of not choosing is visible. Your consequences are fully catching up to you. And they will eventually. If Gemini continues to move without selecting, the same patterns will repeat. More experiences, more engagement, more understanding, but still no accumulation into identity. So this feels like a black hole. Their internal world can certainly feel like a black hole that they fill up with everything. And they still do not feel good inside. It's like a form of depravity. So this can show up as subtle sense of disconnection even when life looks full. Gemini may be busy, socially engaged, mentally active, and still feel like something is missing. Not stimulation, not opportunity, but rootedness, a sense of being in something, not just moving through it. This is where inner masculine begins demanding development, not as concept, but as embodiment. All right, so this is where development must shift from expansion into intentional anchoring. In real life, helping Gemini at this stage is no longer about introducing the idea of commitment. It is about requiring it in specific areas without overwhelming the system. This means identifying one or two domains: career, relationships, location, skill, and beginning to hold them consistently over time. Not because every option has been eliminated, but because one has been chosen long enough to build something real. For example, instead of continuing to pivot between multiple directions, Gemini might choose one path and commit to it for a defined period of time. In relationships, this looks like moving from intermittent engagement into consistency, not just being present when it feels natural, but choosing to remain present over time. Internally, the shift becomes even more important. Gemini begins asking different questions. Not what else could I do, but what am I willing to stand on? Not what makes sense, but what am I choosing to build? So there's also a necessary reduction of open loops. Like I said, my computer's starting to glitch out. So once Gemini begins to experience continuity, once they begin to see something is happening and held over time, the system starts to recognize or to reorganize, because now movement has direction, now understanding has application, now experience begins to accumulate into identity. So what is happening in this stage is not a collapse of Gemini's system. It is a demand for completion. The system has done exactly what it was designed to do: engage, process, and explore. But now it must do what it has delayed: choose, anchor, and build. Because if that does not happen here, then Gemini will continue to move life fully capable and still feel like nothing ever became fully theirs. All right, so closing. What Gemini begins to understand. All right, so I'm actually going to take this key card down. I am sick of looking at it. All right, so I'm ready to scoot the heck over. I think I lost one of my pillows and my back is starting to, I need to adjust my back. I've got a pinched nerve. So, anyways, all right. And I broke my tailbone at one time. Multiple things going on here. I've torn my hip, my shoulder, my knee. Yeah. All right. So, anyways, what Gemini begins to understand as it approaches 30 is something that at first can feel almost disorienting. Because if life forces a reframe of everything it believed was the problem, it was never intelligence, it was never awareness, it was never capability. In fact, those were never weak points in the system at all. They were the reason the system worked as long as it did. Gemini could engage everything. They could enter environments quickly, understand dynamics in real time, and respond with precision while things were still unfolding. They could process information faster than most, track multiple variables at once, and organize chaos into something usable through communication alone. They could explore different paths, adapt to different people, and move between roles without losing functionality. From the outside, that looks like advantage. And for a long time, it is, because the system is built for movement. It is built for interaction. It is built to learn through engagement rather than isolation. So Gemini does not. So Gemini does what it is designed to do: engage, process, explore, and adapt. And because they do all of these things well, there's no immediate pressure to change anything. But over time, something begins to surface that those strengths cannot resolve. Not a lack of understanding, not a lack of opportunity, not even a lack of success in isolated moments. What begins to surface is a lack of something that holds. Gemini may look at their life and see a wide range of experiences, skills, conversations, and insights, but not a clear through line that connects them into something stable. So, more movement is not the missing piece. More processing only generates understanding, but none of those things creates identity on its own. And that is what Gemini begins to see clearly: that the system does not struggle to understand the world, it struggles to define itself within. Because definition was never where the system started, it is where it ended. And if that final step is delayed for too long, everything that comes before it remains unanchored. So experiences do not consolidate, decisions do not stabilize, paths do not deepen, everything stays in motion. Everything stays available, but nothing fully becomes. All right, so I am ready to cap this off. So this is where we're going to pause the development timeline, right at the point where Gemini finally sees the gap, because everything we just walked through from childhood to adolescence to early adulthood into pre-30 pressure was not failure. It was formation. It was a system doing exactly what it was designed to do. So after 30, things start changing because now the system is no longer being measured by how much it can take in. It is being measured by what it can hold. And that is a completely different demand. So in the next video, we're going to move into adult reintegration for Gemini after the age of 30. And this is where everything we've built so far gets reorganized. We're going to walk through all 4 quadrants again, but this time not as development, as correction. How outer masculine shifts from endless processing into direct execution, how inner feminine stabilizes pattern recognition without creating paralysis, how outer feminine becomes intentional experience instead of scattered exploration, and how inner masculine finally comes online as identity, values, and internal anchoring. Because Gemini does not need to lose its speed. They do not need to lose their intelligence, their adaptability. They need to become sequential. They need to learn how to move in a way that builds something that stays. And that is where the system actually becomes powerful, not just because they can understand everything, but because they can finally become something. So if you made it this far, the next video is where everything starts to lock in, where movement turns into direction, where understanding turns into identity, and where Gemini stops living in possibility and starts building reality. All right, y'all. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I am going to crank the last one out and be wild about trying to get my 700-page book edited and out as fast as possible. I am ready to get into the next series. This has been a month and a half, 2 months of hammering, like hammering. I don't even want to think about how many hours I have put well over 100 hours into this in the last month and a half. So anyways, hopefully you enjoyed this video. Hopefully it was coherent, made sense. I am all the way over. Anyways, like and subscribe. Feel free to put your thoughts and feelings in the comment below, the comment section below. Check out my ebooks. I do have a Gemini ego ebook breaking down the cognitive functions and planetary imprints, one of my very first books, and I have 30 books or so on my website. Check that out, and I will see you in the next video.